I'm Jeff Sayer McCord. I'm the director of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Society. As most of you know, we hold an annual conference in New Orleans each November. I hope many of you can make it. One of the great things about this conference was finding a great partner to have a conference here across the Atlantic that would let people who can't come to New Orleans in November participate in the PPE Society and contribute to the intellectual community we're so committed to supporting and encouraging in any way we can. So I'd like to begin with just a couple of thank yous. The first thank you is to each and every one of you. What makes this conference, what's essential to it, the heart of the conference, are the people who come to share ideas, to give feedback to other people who are sharing their ideas, to support a continued attempt to understand well the world we share and how we might try to make it better, how we might celebrate how it's been, where that celebration is appropriate. So I'm hugely grateful to all of you. Thank you very much. I hope you will just briefly applaud everyone else in the room except yourself. This couldn't have happened at all without Sam DiCanio and without the colleagues he enlisted here at King's, the students and the faculty and the moderators who helped the sessions work as well as we could make them work. And so Sam, now if you could help me celebrate Sam. So before the reception, we have our second keynote, and I'd like to introduce our speaker. Laura Valentini is a professor of philosophy and political theory at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. Prior to joining LMU in 2021, she was a professor of philosophy, politics, and economics in the Department of Political Economy here at King's College, London. Before that, and she remains a visiting professor here at King's. No?
Expired recently.
Recently
Website not
expired.
updated. Sorry.
Old news.
But if you want to renew me.
Before that, she was an associate professor of political science at LSE and a lecturer in political philosophy at UCL. Laura has held visiting positions in Australia at august institutions in Australia, Sweden, and the United States. She won the Philip Leverhulme Prize in Politics and International Relations, and in 2023 she was elected to the Academia Europaea. I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly. Laura's work is situated in the fields of contemporary political, legal, and moral philosophy. Her particular research interests include global justice, democracy, freedom, human rights, political obligation, and the methodology of political theory. Today, Laura will be giving a talk on personal sovereignty, natural or institutional. Please join me in welcoming Laura.
Okay. Can you hear me? All right, great. Thank you so much, Jeff, and to the organizers for the invitation and for the conference. I've had 2 wonderful days, and thank you all for being here after a long and intense conference, listening to me talking about personal sovereignty, natural or institutional. And so before I jump into the main topic of the talk, I just want to give you a quick sense of the broader project in which the talk is situated. So, yes. Abracadabra. Simsalabim. Okay. Ha. Second one worked.
The right words.
Excellent. So this is the context. Many, possibly most, but I wanted to be a bit careful, of my colleagues, by whom I mean analytic, moral, and political philosophers, tend to be moral anti-conventionalists. And by this I mean that they tend to presuppose in their theorizing the existence of a very rich set of practice or institution-independent moral facts, what I will call natural moral facts. So moral facts about values, rights, duties, obligations that obtain independently of whatever institutions or practices we might have. And I think that the reason they are so wedded to these natural moral facts is that they think that positing them is necessary in order to explain some of our most deeply held moral judgments. So the worry is, if we thin down our natural moral ontology, if we get rid of some of these natural moral facts, our ability to evaluate and criticize existing behavior and practices and institutions is going to be significantly reduced, because if the normative sources of critique come from the institutions themselves, we might find ourselves in situations in which we want to say things about the institutions, criticize them, but we don't have the materials to do so. So there are limits to immanent critique, and in order to somehow overcome these limits, we need to posit these natural moral facts. And a fair amount of my work seeks to show that some of the moral facts that my colleagues think are natural are in fact best understood as institutional or practice dependent, that is, dependent on norms that exist as a matter of social fact. And another thing that I want to show is that if we thin down our moral ontology in this way, we don't pay excessive costs at the level of explanation or at the level of critique. So we can be less demanding as far as natural moral ontology is concerned and still be able to criticize problematic or pernicious social practices, possibly even better than if we posit these natural moral facts. So that's the ambition. And the talk that I'm going to give today fits into this line of work and will focus on a particular alleged natural moral fact, that is, that we possess personal sovereignty. So this is going to be the target alleged natural moral fact. Okay, so what is personal sovereignty in particular? Here is widely accepted claim, again, in a certain area of moral and political philosophy, namely that human beings are free and equal moral persons. You will have probably heard this claim before. And that therefore each should enjoy a sphere of agency equal to others within which each is sovereign. Within this sphere of agency, each individual may pursue their ends and goals unhindered by others' interference. And each individual has, in an important sense that I'll explain in a moment, normative control over the status of others' actions in this sphere. So standard liberal rights, such as the right to life, to bodily integrity, to property, and so on, are meant to operationalize this idea of equal personal sovereignty. So within the confines of these rights, we are sovereign in the sense that, as I said a moment ago, we have the power to determine the normative, and here by normative I mean mainly moral, status of other people's actions. So, for example, it is up to us to determine, morally speaking, whether others are allowed or not allowed to interact with our bodies and our properties in a particular way. So my say-so is decisive. I don't know, if Jeff wants to hold my hand, well, he is permitted to do so if I give him permission, but he's not permitted to do so if I don't give him permission. And if he's holding my hand and I say, hey, release my hand, Jeff, please, I thereby put him under an obligation to release my hand. So in this domain, for instance, as far as my body is concerned, I am sovereign. I lay down the law for other people in the way that I've just described. Similarly with property, for example. So someone asks, may I drink from your bottle? I say, yes, I have a bit of a cold. I wouldn't recommend it, but anyway, you know, and I give you a permission. But I say, stop, I place an obligation on you. So this is all part of my area of personal sovereignty. Okay, so I hope that the concept has become a bit clearer. And the question that I want to ask in this talk is whether we can possess personal sovereignty in the absence of institutional norms that confer it upon us. So whether we can have this personal sovereignty as a matter of natural morality or whether this is institutional. So let me say something very, very briefly about institutional norms. So at the back of this talk, sort of presupposed by this talk, is a distinction between institutional norms on the one hand and valid moral norms on the other. So by institutional norms, I mean norms that exist as a matter of social fact and are the product of a certain kind of collective intentionality. There are a trillion, maybe an exaggeration, but very many different accounts of social norms, or socially constructed norms or institutional norms. But for the purposes of this talk, I don't need to adjudicate between them. I just mean norms that exist as a matter of social fact, and they can include legal norms, informal conventional norms. So by institutional, I don't mean something super formalized. So yeah, it can include the law, but it can also include something very informal like queuing norms, for example. But this broad category of norms that exist as a matter of social fact. And I want to distinguish them from valid moral norms or principles, which I take to be norms that give us a legitimate basis for criticism as appraisal of behavior, and the violation of which fittingly triggers particular kinds of emotional responses. So when you violate a moral norm, a valid moral norm, it is appropriate for others to feel indignation or resentment, or, well, if you're the one who's violated, guilt in response to that violation. And those valid moral norms are the ones that we employ in order to criticize the norms that we actually endorse within our society and we follow, and the behavior that we engage in. So just to give you a concrete example, very straightforward, slavery norms. So these are institutional norms, institution of slavery, which happen to give unlimited sovereignty to the master vis-a-vis the slave. What this means is that basically the master can lay down the law for the slave in pretty much every domain of his or her life. So the master, the slave is a piece of property, just like this bottle of water is a piece of property, right? These are the institutional norms of slavery. They work this way, and they have a particular distribution of sovereignty. I take it that we think that this is morally unacceptable, so contrary to the slave's freedom and equality. And here I am appealing to something like a valid moral norm, which I stated at the very beginning of the talk to make this particular claim. So this distinction is going to be presupposed by the rest of the talk. So what is the plan for the talk? I raised this question: can we possess personal sovereignty in the absence of institutional norms conferring it upon us? I'm going to sketch two answers, the naturalist and the institutionalist, and then I'm going to look at the implications, at the diagnostic implications of these two answers for cases that involve institutional distributions of sovereignty, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, that strike us as morally problematic, a bit like in the slave case, but something less extreme than the slave case, and see what explanations and diagnoses from what goes wrong in those cases can be arrived at starting from a naturalist perspective versus an institutionalist perspective, and then compare the two. The expectation ex ante should be the naturalist is going to do better. And I think that that's what maybe tacitly many of my colleagues think. And I'm going to suggest, well, no, the institutionalist does as well as, if not better, than the naturalist, both at sort of explanation and diagnosis and criticism. And then I will conclude. Okay, so the two answers, naturalist and institutionalist. So this is a question, I raised this before: can we possess personal sovereignty in the absence of institutional norms that confer it upon us? The naturalist answer is Locke-inspired and, surprise, surprise, is positive, affirmative, it says yes. The institutionalist is Kant-inspired and it answers in the negative, and it says no. One quick caveat followed by another, also quick caveat. So the institutionalist, at least as I understand it here, is not committed to the view that all of morality is institutional, right? So I'm not making the really strong claim that that there are no natural moral facts. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that, I'm targeting one in particular, personal sovereignty, and from the perspective of the institutionalist, so the distinction between naturalist and institutionalist in this talk is just relative to that particular moral fact, personal sovereignty, not the entirety of morality. And now comes the second caveat. Okay, wondering why I'm doing this. So I said that the two answers are respectively Locke-inspired and Kant-inspired. I emphasize this because they are not meant to be, strictly speaking, exegetically Locke and Kant's own, and especially in the case of Kant, whenever one invokes him, irremediably, no matter what one says, one is going to run into trouble. So I am warning you that this is not meant to be an exegetical paper, and warning myself that I might land into trouble nonetheless. But I thought I should, be explicit about this, that I'm not making strong exegetical claims. At the same time, if I presented the pictures but I didn't mention these two thinkers, I would be guilty of plagiarism. So I'm a bit kind of stuck. I think I have to mention them, but at the same time say this is not a big exegetical enterprise. So the naturalist answer, and you see you have a pop-art version of Locke, because that's not like 100% the real Locke, or whether he is doesn't matter. It's just, okay. So in the state of nature, this is going to be political theory 101, and I'm going to go quite quickly. On a broadly naturalist, Locke-inspired pictures, we have full-blown natural rights to life, liberty, and property. So morality already endows us with personal sovereignty independently of institutions. We can have the rights that are constitutive of our personal sovereignty independently of institutions. We can have them in the state of nature. In fact, Locke has an interesting story about how we can appropriate resources, acquire property in the state of nature according to natural law. He says, we mix our labor with them, and provided that we leave enough and it's good for others, we can take them out of the commons, we acquire property rights in them. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't have institutions. In fact, we're probably better off with institutions. Institutional norms, which establish specific roles and powers, for instance, the state, are instrumentally useful to facilitate the fulfillment of our already existing natural rights. Because, well, there are epistemic difficulties in the state of nature, and then, okay, in principle, we're entitled to enforce our own rights in the state of nature, but being judges in our own cause typically is not a very good idea, so we're unlikely to be very fair. So there are inconveniences in the state of nature that make it a good idea to leave the state of nature and create the state, but we are not morally obligated to do so. And indeed, we can treat each other as free and equal, as properly equally sovereign, in the state of nature, even if we have good reason to consent to creating a state. So we have personal sovereignty already in the state of nature. Story is different for Kant. And here, to guard myself even more from the thing that you can tell I am obsessively terrified about, I've put up there a picture, a pop-art picture, not of Kant, but of a Kant lookalike. So to slightly increase the distance. Okay, good. So as free and equal on a Kantian story, we should all be independent of other people's will, not subject to the will of others. But without institutional norms, I take this to be sort of the main insight of the Kantian story, we cannot be. Why is that? Because famously, there are three problems with the state of nature, according to Kant. One is the problem of unilateralism. So in order for us to be free and equal, we need to each have a sphere of agency within which we can pursue our ends and goals. And in order to do that, we need some property. Okay, so how do we get to acquire property? Right, here's a way in which we might do this. We grab an object and we declare it ours. But if this was a successful act of property acquisition, it would imply that our will to acquire this property, will have successfully placed obligations on others no longer to access the particular object that we have declared our property without our consent. That is, we would have subjected other people to our own will through this successful act of acquisition. But that is contrary to the very freedom that, we have innately as human beings. So there is a tension, right, in the state of nature. On the one hand, we need to acquire property in order to be able to pursue our ends and goals and be free and equal. But there isn't a way of acquiring property that does not violate our natural freedom. That is the thought. Second, there are all sorts of indeterminacies. So this goes a bit in the direction of the epistemic problem that sort of also pops up a bit in discussions of Locke. What exactly counts as declaring something ours? Where exactly the boundaries of our rights are supposed to be? There's going to be disagreement or even reasonable disagreement about this. There's going to be coordination problems. We need a coordination mechanism. And then there's a third, more Hobbes-inspired perhaps problem, which is the problem of assurance. And the idea here is that it's unreasonable to expect me to be required to refrain from interfering with others unless I can be reasonably assured that others will do the same. And if we don't have a social institutional order, this problem of assurance persists. Okay, let's assume we've solved problem 1 and problem 2. Why should I refrain from interfering with you and your property in certain ways if I cannot be assured that you will do the same for me? So for us to be able to treat each other, so to cut a long story short, as free and equal on a Kantian picture, we ought to, it's not just a good idea, we have a duty to create complex institutional norms, for Kant this is the state, which provide the requisite omnilateral basis rather than unilateral, problem of unilateralism, for individual sovereignty. Why is that? Institutional norms allow us to solve 3 problems. They are omnilateral in the sense that they're the product of collective intentionality. They provide us shared understandings of our rights and powers, so they help us with the problem of indeterminacy and coordination, and the violation is met with sanctions, thus mitigating the assurance problem. So this is just a sketch of the way in which building institutions is supposed to help us get out of the problems that we identify in the state of nature and that make our freedom and equality not genuinely possible in that kind of condition. So from an institutionalist perspective, unless institutional norms confer personal sovereignty upon us, we do not possess it. In the state of nature, we can't have it. We can only treat each other as properly free and equal under certain institutional settings. And one could also say the more complex, the better organized, the better. Okay, so to sum up the 2 pictures, both naturalists and institutionalists about sovereignty, personal sovereignty, are committed to humans' natural moral freedom and equality. Human beings are naturally free and equal. But naturalists believe that this freedom and equality directly entail personal sovereignty, in a way. Institutionalists believe that this freedom and equality morally mandate the creation of institutional norms that confer personal sovereignty upon us, but without institutions, no personal sovereignty. Freedom and equality, but no personal sovereignty. Okay. Good. Now, applying the answers. Some versions, hopefully, of what I've been saying up to now may be already familiar to some of you. It's a sort of thing that you're exposed to when you start learning about political philosophy. And I have to say that whenever I was confronted with these 2 pictures, I'm asking myself, okay, which one is right? That was kind of my reaction, in the sense that both of them had some appeal. I intuitively found one more appealing than the other, but I would have no idea how to adjudicate between them from first principles. Like, these are 2 hypothetical ways of depicting a hypothetical state of affairs. I don't know. So, sorry, I don't know was not a very technical term, but it conveyed the true feelings that I had when confronted with these 2 pictures. So, in order to adjudicate between them, the strategy that I'm going to employ today is somewhat different. That is, I'm going to ask myself, which one of these 2 pictures, of these 2 understandings of our personal sovereignty, is better from a diagnostic and critical perspective? So what I'm going to do is this. I consider what the 2 answers tell us about concrete cases in which institutional norms are intuitively problematic. That is contrary to our freedom and equality. And, perhaps surprisingly, I will try to convince you that the institutionalist answer is at least no worse, in fact, arguably better, at the diagnostic social critical level than the naturalist one. It gives us a more convincing, a more compelling answer to the question of what goes wrong in cases where our institutional setup clearly gets things wrong from the point of view of personal sovereignty, from a moral point of view. That's the kind of task. Okay, so test case number 1, Rosa Parks. You're going to be familiar with it, the bare-bone facts of the case. So on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was on a Montgomery city bus. At the time, racial segregation laws were in place in Alabama, giving priority seating to white passengers. The bus driver, noticing some white passengers standing, ordered Parks and other African-American passengers to vacate their seats. Parks said no and was later arrested. Okay, so now I'm going to do 2 things. First, I'm going to pinpoint what the relevant institutional facts of the case are. Then I'm going to move on to what I assume our moral intuitions about the case are. And then I'm going to offer the diagnosis of these moral intuitions or explanations of these moral intuitions and judgments that are offered, on the one hand, from a naturalist perspective, on the other hand, from an institutionalist perspective. So, first of all, the institutional facts. As a matter of institutional fact, Parks' no is not an exercise of sovereignty. So, from the perspective of the institutional norms that are prevalent in the context in which her no takes place, hers is not an exercise of sovereignty. It is not up to her, institutionally speaking, whether to remain seated. The driver's order places an institutional obligation on her to vacate the seat. It's a bit like in the case of a slave, right, who says no to the master when the master says sweep the yard. Institutionally, the slave is not exercising their sovereignty. In fact, institutionally, they have no sovereignty in this domain. The sovereignty is all with the master. And indeed, in the institutional context in which this particular act takes place, Parks' no is an act of insubordination or an act of protest. She has no right to refuse institutionally and not making a moral claim. Really important, right? She has no right to refuse. So these are the institutional facts of the case, I take it. Moral judgments in need of explanation. Rosa Parks was wronged. Her no should have resulted in her being allowed to stay seated. The driver and the police should not have removed her from the seat, arrested, etc., etc. Morally speaking, stuff went wrong there. Okay, naturalist explanation of these moral judgments. So from a naturalist perspective, Parks' natural moral freedom and equality directly imply that she has sovereignty over whether she should remain seated independently of institutions in a way. Whether the institutions recognize this sovereignty is, for the naturalist, neither here nor there. Morally speaking, she has it because she's an equal. And clearly, by not having that sovereignty in that particular context, she's not being treated as an equal. So by not having that sovereignty recognized in that context, she's not being treated as an equal. Parks' no morally prohibits others from removing her from her seat or placing sanctions on her if she does not vacate her seat. The naturalist says the moral facts are such that even if the institutions don't recognize that her no places an obligation on others not to remove her, it does. It's a moral obligation and it's there because she does have this sovereignty even if the institutions don't confer it on her. If she's removed or interfered with, arrested, fined, etc., for not leaving her seat, she's wronged because her sovereignty is violated. So the nature of the wrong is a sovereignty violation in this case because she has her sovereignty. Now, those occupying certain institutional roles disregard the sovereignty that Parks already possesses, morally speaking, and thus wrong her. Institutions are not constitutive of that sovereignty for the naturalist, but they make it more or less likely that it be violated by individuals. Now, what about the institutionalist explanation? The institutionalist cannot say that Parks has her sovereignty violated because she does not possess that sovereignty until institutions confer it upon her. And the relevant institutions there don't confer it upon her. That was part of the case. But what the institutionalists can say is this: existing norms fail to honor Parks' innate freedom and equality, so she's deprived of a sovereignty she ought morally to possess. As free and equal, she ought to have it, but she doesn't have it. The institutions deprive her of a sovereignty she ought to possess. And since everyone recall the Kantian story, has a duty to create and support institutions enabling the realization of our equal freedom, everyone who sustains the sovereignty-denying norms and not specific individuals interfering with her wrongs Pax. This is a more structural or institutional, surprise, surprise, it's an institutionalist view perspective on the wrong, right? Okay, so you might think, so far, maybe the institutionalist perspective, not completely crazy. So here the main wrong is one of sovereignty deprivation, not of sovereignty violation, because she doesn't have the sovereignty in the first place, morally speaking. And the culprits are not specific individuals, but those who sustain the institutional structures that do not give her a sovereignty that she ought to have. But what about this second case? This is a case of marital rape. There are no graphic details whatsoever, but I hope this is not going to be upsetting to anyone. So this is the second case, and I think this is a trickier case for the kind of position that I want to defend. So in Wendy's society, there's no concept of marital rape. Hence, the law does not prohibit such conduct. Husbands have an institutionally established right to intimate contact with their wives. One evening, Wendy tells her husband, who was seeking intimate contact with her, no, please, not now. He goes ahead anyway. Okay, same pattern as before, institutional facts of the case. So as a matter of institutional fact, Wendy's utterance does not give her husband a prohibition to proceed. Emphasize, institutional fact, not talking about morality. Okay, good. Institutionally, Wendy lacks sovereignty over her husband's intimate access to her body. Wendy's no, in the context, as a speech act, is going to likely count as an instance of begging. It depends on the fine details of the context, but depending on how she says it, it may either be an instance of begging, a bit like, please, not now, or as a request, or if accompanied by further resistance, again, as an act of insubordination or defiance, given the institutional structure of the husband-wife relationship in the society that I'm imagining. Okay, these are the institutional facts. Then, moral judgments in need of explanation, as before. Wendy's wronged, hoping that's not very controversial. Her husband should have refrained from having intimate contact with her. How do we explain this? Again, naturalist explanation. Very similar story to what I told before. So I'm going to be quick here. So Wendy's sovereignty is dependent of institutions. Hence, her say-so morally determines what her husband may or may not do to her. Wendy's no does place a moral prohibition on Hugh. She has that sovereignty. If he has intimate contact with her, Hugh morally wrongs her by violating her sovereignty. The wrong is a sovereignty violation. And we can primarily make sense of the wrong that is suffered by Wendy at an individual level. Sure, institutions, even from a naturalist perspective, are problematic. So the fact that there's the lack of a concept, and indeed of a law that prohibits marital rape. But the reason they're problematic is that they make it more likely that husbands would violate their wives' sovereignty. Okay, which they already possess as a matter of moral fact. Institutionalist explanation. The institutionalists, again, cannot say that Hugh wrongs Wendy by violating her sovereignty. The institutionalists can say, existing norms fail to honor Wendy's innate freedom and equality. She's deprived of a sovereignty she ought morally to possess on account of these freedom and equality. And since everyone has a duty to create and support institutions enabling the realization of our equal freedom, it's the same story that I told before, everyone who sustains the sovereignty-denying norms, and not just Hugh, wrongs Wendy and women like her. Again, we're pushed towards a more structural institutional perspective on the wrong. And then at this point, I don't know, difficult to tell what you thought about the Rosa Parks case, but if you were sympathetic to that one, when presented with this institutionalist diagnosis, you might think, hold on a second, Laura, something seems to have gone wrong here. Because surely we don't want Hugh to get off the moral hook quite so easily. It seems that he is in a distinctive moral position vis-a-vis the wrong that Wendy suffers, that everyone else who sustains the sovereignty-denying norms is not. So can the institutionalist say something in response to this? So I think the institutionalist can. I'm trying to check the time. Okay, now I've succeeded. Okay, but don't we also want to say that Hugh in particular wrongs Wendy if he ignores her no? And here I think there are two responses available to the institutionalist. And remember, the institutionalist is an institutionalist about sovereignty, not about everything. First response, it still remains the case that we have obligations that are not institution dependent. And one obligation we may very well have is not to be cruel to other people, not to impose conduct on them that they very strongly don't want to have imposed upon them. And so one thing that Hugh does is wronging Wendy by making her needlessly suffer, by being cruel, by going ahead anyway, despite her no, because clearly her no signals that that's not something that she wants, even if, institutionally speaking, she doesn't have the authority to obligate her husband not to go ahead by saying no. And then there's a second response. This is a little bit trickier, but I think that the institutionalist can avail him or herself of it. And this is that even without institutional norms, we might posit, and I don't find it so implausible, that there is a natural duty, a bit like the natural duty not to be cruel, not to make people needlessly suffer, not to interfere with others' bodies without their consent or authorization. It just so happens that on an institutionalist picture, until the relevant institutional norms are in place, people like Wendy lack the power to consent, to give permission, which is part of sovereignty. The problem is that she lacks the powers to consent or refuse her husband's sexual advances because she doesn't have sovereignty in that particular domain according to the norms of that society. So if she lacks the power, then if her husband has intimate contact with her, he wrongs her. She has a valid moral complaint against him. Why? Because she's not consented. Why is she not consented? Well, she didn't have the power to consent, so she could not have consented in the first place, right? So the wrong in this case, if you go institutionalist, does not stem from a violation of personal sovereignty, since Wendy lacked that sovereignty, but the particular wrong that Hugh is culpable of goes back to the violation of independent background duties, natural duties, not to make others needlessly suffer, and not to interfere with them in certain ways without consent. Only problem is that in this kind of situation, Wendy doesn't have a power to consent. And so by default, the interference is problematic. Okay, so very briefly to sum up, and then I have a couple of more slides and then I'm gonna be done. I don't know how I'm doing with time, okay. So comparison. So I looked at these two cases and sort of contrasted the naturalist and the institutionalist perspective. So the nature of the wrong. For the naturalist, in both cases, the Parks case and the Wendy case, the wrong is a sovereignty violation. For the institutionalist, it is a sovereignty deprivation of a sovereignty that the victims ought to have. The main wrongdoers for the naturalist are specific individuals who violate the victim's sovereignty. For the institutionalists, they're individuals who, to various degrees, support an institutional system that deprives the victim of sovereignty, that doesn't give them a sovereignty that they ought to have. And then there are also secondary wrongdoers. So it's not that, you know, the naturalist is blind to institutions, the institutionalist is blind to individuals, but the secondary wrongdoers for the naturalist are individuals who support a system that increases the chances of victim sovereignty being violated. And for the institutionalist, it's individuals who behave violently, cruelly, or use their de facto sovereignty or power in ways that they ought not to. So they take advantage of a de facto sovereignty or power that they have de facto because it's conferred on them by the norms that exist as a matter of social facts in ways that they morally ought not to. Okay. So in defense of institutionalism, so which explanation should we prefer? You already know what my answer is. So the institutionalist answer, it seems to me, allows us for deeper social critique. Why is that? Because it seems to better capture the depth of the wrong that is suffered by those who are systematically disempowered by the institutions we create and sustain. So I think there's a difference between saying that someone's sovereignty is being violated, and that's bad, but saying that someone lacks sovereignty altogether, a sovereignty that they ought to have. So in one case, I'm violating your sovereignty, that's bad. But in the other case, you don't even have that sovereignty, and you ought to have it. And this can account for some of the complaints that often those that might be described as the oppressed and so on voice. For instance, the fact that they're voiceless. There are certain things that they cannot do with their words. I'm here echoing a little bit Ray Langton, for instance. So, you know, Wendy, with her no, cannot refuse. And that, I think, is something that should be also marked morally. It's different from a no that counts as a refusal, but is then ignored. So the nature of the wrong, when the sovereignty is taken away from the person, is even deeper. Infantilization, objectification, these are all things that I think we can capture pretty well if we say not just the sovereignty has been violated, but the sovereignty is not there in the first place when it ought to be, so being deprived of the sovereignty. And then the second point, which I think is somewhat weaker, but maybe the institutionalist picture more seamlessly directs our attention to the primary source of the wrong, which is not at the individual level, but at the collective one. Again, the naturalist is not blind to the collective level, but I think that if you go for a naturalist picture, you're immediately drawn to the particular individual who was, morally speaking, placed under an obligation not to remove Rosa Parks by her no from the bus seat, or not to go ahead in the case of Wendy because she said no, and kind of focus specifically on them, and only later on think, oh, well, hold on a sec, well, you know, that's clearly what's gone wrong here, and kind of miss or not give enough weight to the way in which the broader institutional context is actually responsible for a lot of what is going on. Okay, so I will conclude with an objection or worry that may have already occurred to some of you. And this is that the institutionalist proves way too much. So we throw the baby out with the bathwater, I guess one can say. And some of you may have thought this, I don't know, but when I introduced my response to the concern that Hugh was getting off the hook way too easily, because I said, well, no, it's not, because, see, Wendy lacks the power to consent, so if he has an obligation not to interfere with her body without her consent, well, he automatically violates that obligation because she lacks the power. So it follows from the institutionalist position that Wendy and Parks lack the capacity to consent to refuse in the relevant domains. This capacity to consent to refuse is constitutive of sovereignty. I hope that this is clear. So, you know, when I consent, I give you a permission, lay down the law. When I refuse, you're obligated not to interfere, I lay down the law. So it's just part of the sovereignty, like the examples I gave of the bottle of water, telephone, holding hand at the beginning. For instance, and I'm going to take the case that I guess is going to be most tricky for me, sexual intercourse between Wendy and her husband is not properly permissible, even when they're both willing, until institutional norms confer on her the requisite sovereignty or capacity to consent. Because I take it, the idea is that sex is not properly permissible unless it is consensual. And if the view is that unless institutional norms confer a certain power upon us, the power to consent, which is part of our personal sovereignty, we don't have it, Wendy, in this particular case, lacks the capacity to consent, so this seems to follow. But isn't this too extreme? No, I can't tell what you think, but I'm assuming that, you know, either you are completely shocked that I would even entertain this thought, or you're extremely radical and you're like, no, it's not too extreme, go for it. Okay, so this is my response. And this is that I'm going to bite the bullet. And, okay, again, don't know what you think. But I'm going to bite the bullet for the following reason. So, with some caveats, and the caveats are going to conclude the talk. So, take a case which is a slightly morally better version of the original Hugh and Wendy case. Imagine Hugh and Wendy create a bilateral norm between them, and that could be a mini local institutional norm, whereby Wendy's yes counts as consent and her no as refusal, just between the two of them. Society-wise, the norm does not exist, stipulated, but between the two of them. In this case, which is a better case than the original one, Wendy's a bit, so Hugh doesn't go ahead if she says no, because, you know, there is this bilateral norm. Wendy's ability to consent is still a gift, in a way we could say, that Hugh gives her. And, okay, locally, she acquires a certain kind of sovereignty in virtue of this norm, which is better than the original situation. But she's still, in an important sense, at the mercy of someone else. and sovereignty that we only possess due to the grace of someone else, so to say, doesn't feel like real sovereignty, right? You know, I'm sovereign in this domain, but only because Hugh is nice enough to recognize it. There's something a little bit too fleeting. So there is something still morally suboptimal, I think, about the interaction between Wendy and Hugh. Given broader social structures, they cannot relate to each other as equals, even if Hugh offers her this possibility. But the structural positions in which they find each other, because of the sexist norms that govern their society, is such that a true relationship between equals is not possible among them. So we have a situation in which Hugh remains a benevolent dominator. Do I want to say that, therefore, all intimate relationships between them, even in the kind of slightly nicer scenario, is all things considered super impermissible, just as bad as, you know, the most horrifying cases of rape you can think of? No, I do not want to say that. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that I've not come up with a good moral vocabulary to recognize this, because the binary language of permissibility and impermissibility doesn't allow for these kind of nuances, that to some extent, there is still something morally suboptimal about the interaction between them, even when Hugh, given the social situation, does everything within his power to be a good egalitarian husband. Because of the social structures, he is put in a position where he cannot, it's strictly speaking impossible for him, to write in a fully morally clean way, and for the interaction between them to be fully morally clean. I mean, the feminists, I think, had a slogan, so sort of, all sex under patriarchy is rape. I don't want to go that far, but I think that there is something in that insight, and it's important to recognize it. And I don't have, as I said, a fully developed moral vocabulary, but I think that we would have to worry if, even in this case, you didn't have any qualms or worries about the type of relationship that he has with his wife, given the broader social structure. Okay, so to conclude, the institutionalist view has considerable critical potential, I think, and provides us with a picture of morality that emphasizes our collective responsibilities, captures the depth of the wrong that are suffered by those who are disempowered, and confronts us perhaps with the sobering, somewhat depressing fact. So more depression. Yesterday in the keynote, there were some sort of depressing facts about willingness to pay to read the news. Maybe this is also a bit depressing. That our ability to do the right thing also depends on what others do. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm wondering if we can solve your problem at the end of like moral vocabulary by just having a scalar notion of consent. So, you know, when we talk about consent, it's natural to talk about it in binary terms, how we usually talk about it. But many of the things that go into consent, like our knowledge of the situation, how independent we are from others, how much pressure we're under, are obviously scalar. So you might think that, like, we should actually be thinking of consent as kind of a scale of consensuality. But if you've got a scalar notion of consent, then you can say that an act is more consensual the better the norms are or something. We probably never get to perfection, but we get a difference in these cases.
So yeah, I like the idea. I like the idea of degrees of consent. One tricky thing about it, I guess, is the following: that we want to know what the normative output of consent is. So once you've consented, what happens there? And this is typically cashed out in terms of permissibility and impermissibility. So if you've given valid consent, permission; if you've not, prohibition. And the degrees of consent story, I guess, will have to come up with a similarly graded picture of what the output is. So, you know, maybe in terms of strength of reasons for doing something or not doing something. And so one should switch from a sort of permissibility and permissibility obligation framework to a reasons-based framework. And maybe that might be a way of helping. So I think, you know, I find the suggestion congenial. I haven't worked through it, but I think one key issue is going to be, you know, how do we conceptualize then the normative output of consent? Do we go for reasons and stuff? So, but yeah.
Great. I have a question about what a naturalist might say and how it might I was confused like whether or not it is actually meaningfully different from what you're saying. So one thing you said is there's a difference between saying your sovereignty is violated versus you lack sovereignty completely. But I thought the naturalist would say, look, as a social fact, you do lack sovereignty, right? Morally speaking, you have this normative power. It's just as a social fact, you can't exercise that normative power. So there is still a really important sense in which you lack sovereignty as a social fact. And that sounds to me like pretty much the same thing as what you said, because you also say, well, you ought to have that sovereignty. So that sounds just like different ways of saying the same thing. So I was wondering, like, what is the difference?
So I don't think there are different ways of saying the same thing. In the following sense, so the naturalist says that, you have sovereignty independently of whether, as a moral matter, which is all the sovereignty that fundamentally matters. It's a sort of personal sovereignty, the ability to lay down the law with a capital L, which is the moral law in this domain. And whether you have it or not is independent of institutions. What the naturalist can say is, well, these institutions are not properly recognizing the sovereignty that you already possess, morally speaking. So you can already do all of this all of these lawmaking activities, giving permission, placing obligations, etc. You can do it. The institutionalist says, no, you're free and equal, but that does not entail that you have the sovereignty. It entails that you ought to have it. So the moral diagnosis that I offered of the two cases from the institutionalist and from the naturalist seem different. So I hope that at least when I was giving the moral diagnosis, the difference was obvious. So the naturalist can say, and this is something that I think, especially in the Hugh Wendy scenario, find very appealing about naturalism. What Hugh is doing is a violation of the sovereignty, of the personal sovereignty of Wendy. The institutionalists can't say that. It's not a violation of the personal sovereignty because that sovereignty is not there. The fact that the institutional sovereignty isn't there means that at the moral level as well, she's not capable of laying down the law in a particular way. So it is a difference. Once I put it this way, maybe you might think, well, then I'm completely off, I jump off the boat of the institutionalist. But I don't think they are the same for this reason. You look very perplexed, but I can't say more, I think, in a kind of normativized sense of Kant.
Yes, thank you very much, Lara. What a fascinating talk.
I always worry when people say fascinating. Go ahead.
No, it is really. I mean, I will think about it even later than in this hour. There seems to be one important difference between the naturalist and institutionalist view. I hope you will agree that for the naturalist, the sovereignty is already there, so the state cannot create it, and therefore it doesn't get any worse to misbehave in front of black people, for instance, after the institution has put this and written this into law. And this is counterintuitive, and in that sense it favors your view that you should be an institutionalist, because intuitively it's much worse in the year 2025 to do certain things after we had all these awareness things happening, extra laws, and certain behaviors, be it in relationships, be it with respect to ethnicities and so on, today are much worse, because today we violate, on the institutionalist view, not just the moral norm, but also a sovereignty that has been created. Whereas, go back 50, 100, 2,000 years ago, in the past, you did already violate the moral norm. It was already very bad to rape and to certain things, but it was less bad than today, because at that time there was no, according to the institutionalist view, there was not yet that sovereignty. Does that make sense?
So it does make sense. I probably respond by saying I think it's a fascinating comment. And but seriously, but I think also, given that I have probably -1 minute, I think I will sort of suspend judgment on it now, because I do not know whether the comment commits. You talked about goodness and badness rather than wrongness and rightness. So I don't know whether, but basically I don't know what I think about the idea that certain acts become more wrong depending on the way in which our institutions develop and, whether new, morally relevant social institutional facts are brought into existence. So I've not thought about this. I find it interesting, but before I say whether I'm on board or not, I want to think more about it. This thing is being recorded, so I need to be careful. Thanks, Franz.
Is it better to be at the mercy of one person or to be at the mercy of us all, or some arbitrarily determined share of us all? Do people behave more morally as individuals or in groups?
Okay, great. So I take it, the concern here is, well, why do you think that institutions, if I understood the concern correctly, then why think that institutions, which, unlike in the case of sort of one-on-one relationships, are sort of involve a collectivity of individuals, are any better guarantees for sort of better constitutive of our personal sovereignty than, just nice Hugh vis-a-vis Wendy? Is that the kind of worry? So I think it's a fair worry, and it's based, and the claim that I make is based on what strikes me, and here I might be getting into trouble, as a sort of broad social scientific regularity that typically institutions have a bit more robustness than just individual behavior. You can have a very nice person as your husband or wife, but in this case, husband, given the example. But I do think that the fact that this person possesses an institutionally constituted power that is kind of omnilaterally supported, to use the Kantian language, because its existence depends on a gazillion people going along with a certain set of norms, etc., is highly problematic from the perspective of someone like Wendy, even if we think that it's very unlikely that Hugh will actually take advantage of that particular power. In a way that I think if we are in a kind of type of society where the power is distributed more equally, but, Wendy happens to have a bad husband, maybe for her in that particular transaction, the situation might be locally worse, but at least she has some institutional guarantees. She can, so if Hugh starts behaving badly, she can go to the courts. And Hugh is aware of this. So we can conjure up, I think, examples in which we just think that the agent, the Hugh, is psychologically incapable of being nasty, and situations in which somehow an egalitarian social order could flip in a moment, right? And I take it that's the worry that you have. And in that kind of situation, I would have to largely agree with you. But I'm assuming that under a set of broadly plausible real-world assumptions that seem relevant when we're interested in sort of analysis of our societies as we know them and human relations as we know them, I am more concerned about, the social order empowering the Hughes in this way. And I prefer to have a social order that doesn't do that, even if perhaps I'm really lucky and Hugh is a lovely guy.
Okay, so we're running out of time, but we have two final questions, and can we just get them one after the other, and then Laura can respond to both of them very quickly.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My question's maybe a clarifying one about what exactly the distinction between natural and institutional is tracking. It seems like, sure, maybe like it's contingent that a particular institution exists, but I'm thinking about maybe like some Wittgensteinians sort of argue that like certain institutions exist by sort of like nature of what it is to be like a human. So like Peter Winch has an argument that like like community, like being like you can't be a human without being a community, and like community is impossible without language, and language is impossible without some sort of like moral prohibition on lying. Because if anyone can lie whenever, then you don't know what's true, and like communication just is impossible. So I was wondering, like, I mean, can't you just argue that like, well, institutions themselves are natural, and so we can sort of institutional obligations are themselves natural?
Thank you very much for the talk. A lot of what you say resonates with Philip Pettit's work on non-domination. I figured that was kind of implicit. And I was wondering about the idea of sustaining unjust institutions. What does it count to sustain an unjust institution? So since we're attributing moral culpability to people who live in a society and sustain these institutions, so for example, someone's born into a slave culture where slavery is legal and customary, how would we know if they're sustaining that institution? You might say they should be fighting against that institution. If they're not fighting against it, then they're sustaining it. But do we have a duty to fight against all unjust institutions? Do we have to fight all the fires, the moral fires in our world? So that's kind of, you get what my point is. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I'll take them in reverse order, if that's okay. So that's a completely fair question. And my quick answer to this, to it is, we'll need, of course, the institutionalist perspective needs to be coupled with a plausible account of what individual responsibilities for institutional injustice are going to be. And there's a whole industry of writings about this. So it's true that, so if you want, and I don't have a fully fledged account of it, and a lot of it is going to be contextual. So we need to look at the particular nature of the institutions, the particular position that the individuals occupy, the extent to which they're causally responsible, morally responsible, able to respond, whether they're just blameless wrongdoers or whether they are sort of blameworthy wrongdoers, and so on and so forth. So in a way, I'm kind of conceding your point. I think that it's an open question. I don't have an abstract answer to it. But it's true that answering these questions is philosophically extremely complex. In a way, one thing that the institutionalist view does is it inherits the social complexity of these dynamics into the philosophical analysis. And so you might think that that is a bug of the view. I think it's kind of a feature because that's what we want to analyze, but you might consider it a bug of the view. And I don't know whether that was the direction in which you were going, but I can't talk much longer, so I'll stop here. So to the question, so whether in a way we can collapse the distinction, if I understand the question correctly, because at least on certain views, somehow human interaction is such that by definition it's almost institutional. So the natural with a capital N is just a fiction. It doesn't exist. So I am very sympathetic to this view. But if I were to assume this view, I would, I think to some extent, already assume what I want to prove against the naturalists. And because I do think that really quite a lot of my colleagues have strong naturalist instincts of this kind, I'm just going to say, I'm going to lay out the two positions. So, yeah.
Thanks so much for the talk, Laura.